I stood in the main conference room of Tech Vista Solutions at 9:30 on a Monday morning, surrounded by 40 of my colleagues. Brandon Whitmore, the founder's son who had just taken over as CEO after his father's sudden retirement, pointed directly at me. His voice boomed across the room as he declared I was fired for incompetence. He demanded I hand over all company property immediately. Without a word, I reached into my pocket, pulled out a single set of keys, and slid them across the polished table toward him. They made a soft clinking sound as they came to rest in front of his hands. The room fell completely silent. Brandon picked up the keys, examined them briefly, and smirked at me like he had just won the greatest victory of his life. He had no idea what he was holding. I walked out of that building carrying a small cardboard box with a coffee mug, a framed photo of my mother, and a succulent plant that had somehow survived 7 years on my desk. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed through the glass doors into the parking lot. The September sun felt too bright, too cheerful for what had just happened. I set the box on the passenger seat of my Honda and sat behind the wheel, staring at the building where I had spent a third of my life. 7 years ago, I joined Tech Vista Solutions as a junior project manager fresh out of graduate school with an MBA and mountains of student debt. The company was smaller then, maybe 70 employees, and Richard Whitmore, the founder, had interviewed me personally. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes. He asked me about my goals, my values, and what I thought made a good leader. I told him I believed leadership was about service, not power. He smiled and hired me on the spot. I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life. I managed projects that came in under budget and ahead of schedule. I built relationships with clients who became loyal advocates for our company. I mentored junior employees and helped them grow. When the director of operations position opened 4 years into my tenure, Richard promoted me. He told me I reminded him of himself when he was younger, hungry and principled and willing to do whatever it took to build something meaningful. Richard became more than a boss. He attended my mother's birthday party when she turned 60. He wrote me a personal check when I needed emergency money for her medical bills after she was diagnosed with lupus. He treated me like family, and I trusted him completely. When he announced his retirement 3 weeks ago due to heart problems, I felt genuine grief. But I tried to stay optimistic when he introduced his son Brandon as the new CEO. Brandon had worked at Tech Vista exactly once before, about 5 years ago. He spent 6 months in a junior marketing role, mostly missing deadlines and complaining about the company culture. Then he left to pursue other ventures. Richard rarely talked about those ventures, but I learned through industry gossip that Brandon had burned through investor money on 3 failed startups. Each one collapsed due to mismanagement and Brandon's inability to keep talented people on his team. 3 weeks ago, Richard brought Brandon back to groom him for leadership. From the first day, I felt Brandon's resentment. He would walk past my office and glance in with cold eyes. He questioned my decisions in meetings, not with genuine curiosity, but with thinly veiled hostility. Employees came to me privately and said Brandon was asking pointed questions about my authority and how much influence I had with Richard. This morning's meeting was Brandon's first official gathering as CEO. He spent 20 minutes criticizing everything about the company. He said the culture was too soft, too consensus-driven, and that real leadership required making hard decisions. Then he pointed at me and said I had created a toxic environment where people questioned authority. He claimed multiple employees had complained about me but refused to name them or provide any documentation when I asked. He said his decision was final and demanded I hand over all company property immediately. I thought about arguing. I thought about defending myself in front of everyone. But I saw the look on his face and realized he wanted a scene. He wanted me to beg or cry or lose my composure so he could feel powerful. Instead, I gave him the keys to the entire campus and walked out with my head high. Now, sitting in my car, reality crashed over me. My mortgage payment was due in 12 days. My student loans were on an income-based repayment plan that would adjust if I lost my salary. My mother's medical bills were partially covered by insurance, but I paid for her medications and specialist visits. I had maybe 3 months of savings if I was careful. My phone buzzed with texts from colleagues. Jennifer from accounting wrote that she was crying and furious. Craig from IT said the whole thing was wrong and illegal. Others sent hearts and supportive messages. I responded to a few, reassuring them I would be okay, but I felt hollow inside. That evening, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was Martin Huxley, the company's attorney for the past 15 years. I had worked with Martin on contract negotiations and legal reviews. He was in his 50s, methodical and careful with his words. Martin sounded tense. He asked if I could come to the office tomorrow morning at 8. I asked why. He paused, then said carefully that there may have been a procedural error in my termination. He could not say more over the phone but needed to speak with me in person. I agreed to come, though my stomach twisted with anxiety. I could not sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, playing out scenarios in my mind. I assumed Martin wanted me to sign a settlement agreement to avoid a wrongful termination lawsuit. Brandon probably realized he had acted impulsively and wanted to clean up the mess quietly. I knew I could not afford a legal battle even if I had grounds to sue. I would have to accept whatever they offered and move on. By the time my alarm went off at 6 in the morning, I had convinced myself that my career at Tech Vista was over. I would listen to what Martin had to say, sign whatever papers needed signing, and start searching for a new job. I dressed in a simple gray suit and drove to the office, preparing myself for closure. I arrived at the Tech Vista campus at 7:50 in the morning. The security guard, Joe, looked surprised to see me but waved me through when I scanned my badge. Apparently, Brandon had not bothered to deactivate my access yet. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor where Martin's office was located and knocked on his door at exactly 8. Martin looked like he had not slept. His tie was slightly crooked and there were dark circles under his eyes. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Before he could say anything, his door flew open, and Brandon stormed in. Brandon's face was red with anger. He demanded to know why I was in the building. I said nothing, and looked at Martin. Martin stood up and said calmly that he had invited me to discuss a legal matter. Brandon accused me of trespassing and ordered Martin to have security remove me immediately. Martin's voice remained even but firm. He said that as general counsel, he had a duty to address serious legal issues, and this qualified. Brandon glared at both of us, but reluctantly agreed to stay and listen. He remained standing with his arms crossed over his chest, radiating hostility. Martin pulled a document from a folder on his desk. It was my employment contract from 6 years ago when Richard promoted me to Director of Operations. Martin asked Brandon if he had reviewed this contract before terminating my employment. Brandon dismissed the question with a wave of his hand and said he did not need permission to fire incompetent employees. Martin explained carefully that my contract included specific termination provisions. According to the terms Richard and I had agreed to, I could only be fired for cause if there was documented evidence of performance issues and a formal review process. Without that documentation, the company owed me 2 years of severance pay plus benefits continuation. Brandon laughed, and said he would not pay me a single dollar. He insisted I was fired for cause based on complaints from multiple employees. Martin asked to see the documentation. Brandon said the complaints were verbal and confidential. Martin explained that verbal complaints were insufficient under the contract terms and did not constitute proper documentation for a termination with cause. Brandon's face darkened. He accused Martin of disloyalty and being too friendly with me. He said that as CEO, he had the authority to fire anyone at any time, and if Martin had a problem with that, Martin could be fired too. Martin remained calm. He pointed out that he had drafted my contract personally at Richard's specific request. Richard had wanted to protect my position because he valued my contributions and leadership. The contract was legally binding and had been reviewed by outside counsel. Terminating me without following the proper procedures exposed the company to significant liability. Brandon grabbed his phone and called his father, putting the call on speaker. Richard's voice came through, weak and strained. Brandon did not ask how his father was feeling. Instead, he demanded that Richard confirm he could fire anyone he wanted as CEO. There was a long pause. Then Richard spoke slowly, asking what this was about. Brandon explained that Martin was trying to force him to pay me severance. Richard asked if Brandon had reviewed my contract before taking action. Brandon said he did not need to. Richard's voice became firmer. He told Brandon that the contract was binding and that Brandon should have consulted with Martin before making any personnel decisions, especially ones involving senior leadership. Brandon's face went from red to purple. He ended the call abruptly and turned to me. He said I could have 1 month of severance and that I needed to sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak negatively about the company or him. He said this was his final offer. I looked at Martin. He gave a small shake of his head, so subtle that Brandon might not have noticed. I took a breath and said I declined the offer. Brandon exploded. He called me greedy and ungrateful. He said I was trying to extort the company. He accused me of manipulating his father and turning employees against him. His voice rose with each sentence until he was nearly shouting. Finally, he stormed out of the office, slamming the door so hard that a framed degree on Martin's wall rattled. Martin waited until Brandon's footsteps faded down the hallway. Then he turned to me with an expression I could not quite read. He asked me what keys I had given Brandon yesterday. I explained that they were the master keys to the entire campus. Richard had given them to me 3 years ago when I took over responsibility for facilities management and security coordination. The keys opened every building, every office, the server rooms, the storage areas, everything. Martin's face went pale. He asked if Brandon understood what those keys accessed. I said I assumed someone would have explained it to him or that Brandon would have asked before using them. Martin closed his eyes briefly and muttered something under his breath. Then he told me that Brandon had spent yesterday afternoon making decisions and issuing orders to various department heads. Last night, around midnight, Brandon had used the keys to enter the primary server room. Security footage showed him disconnecting cables and pressing buttons on equipment he clearly did not understand. This morning, the IT director discovered that multiple critical systems had gone offline. My heart sank. I asked how bad the damage was. Martin said he did not have full details yet, but that Craig, the IT director, was frantically working with his team to assess the situation. Martin asked if I would come with him to the IT department. The way he asked made it clear this was not optional. Something terrible had happened, and somehow I was about to be pulled back into the middle of it. Martin and I hurried down 2 floors to the IT department. The space was normally calm and organized, with developers and technicians working quietly at their desks. Today it looked like a disaster zone. Craig stood in the center of the room surrounded by 3 senior technicians, all of them typing frantically on laptops. Multiple monitors displayed error messages and system logs. Craig looked up when he saw me, and the relief on his face was immediate and visible. Craig was in his early 40s, balding, with glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He had been with Tech Vista for 9 years and built the IT infrastructure from the ground up. He was brilliant, patient, and one of the kindest people I had ever worked with. Right now, he looked terrified. He explained the situation quickly. Brandon had entered the primary server room at approximately midnight. Security footage showed him disconnecting multiple cables from the main servers and pressing buttons on the environmental control panel. Within minutes, critical systems began failing. The customer database was inaccessible. The payment processing system was offline. Most importantly, their flagship software service that supported 800 corporate clients across the country had crashed completely. Craig said that every minute of downtime cost the company approximately $3,000 in service-level agreement penalties. Clients had contracts guaranteeing 99.9% uptime. If systems were not restored within 72 hours, the damages could reach into the millions. Some clients might terminate their contracts entirely. I immediately started asking questions. Which servers were affected? What was the sequence of disconnections? Were the backup systems intact? Craig answered each question, and I could see him thinking through the problem more clearly as we talked. I had helped coordinate the major system upgrade 2 years ago and worked closely with Craig's team. I was not an IT expert, but I understood the infrastructure layout and the disaster recovery protocols. Craig looked at Martin and said something that made my chest tighten. He said I was the only person outside the IT department who understood their systems well enough to help with recovery. Richard had always emphasized cross-functional knowledge, and I had spent weeks learning the technical details during the upgrade project. At that moment, Brandon entered the IT department with 2 men in expensive suits. He introduced them as consultants he had hired overnight to review company operations and improve efficiency. He saw me working with Craig's team, and his expression turned furious. He demanded I leave the building immediately. Craig stood up and faced Brandon. Craig was not a confrontational person, but his voice was steady when he said I was helping fix the crisis Brandon had created. Brandon denied touching anything in the server room. He said the system failures must have been caused by poor maintenance or inadequate security protocols, and that proved the company needed new leadership. Martin pulled out his phone and connected it to one of the large monitors on the wall. He played security footage from the server room. The timestamp showed 11:52 the previous night. The video clearly showed Brandon entering the room, looking around uncertainly, then walking up to the server racks and disconnecting cables. He pressed several buttons on a control panel, frowned at the screen, then left. The whole sequence took less than 10 minutes, but the damage was catastrophic. The room went silent. One of Brandon's consultants stepped forward and asked to see the footage again. Martin replayed it. The consultant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, pulled Brandon aside. They had a whispered conversation that grew increasingly heated. Finally, the consultant turned to Martin and said they needed to speak with Richard Whitmore immediately. Martin called Richard and put the phone on speaker. Richard answered. His breathing labored. Martin explained what had happened as diplomatically as possible. The consultant interrupted and introduced himself as Andrew Chen, a specialist in corporate risk management. He explained that Brandon's actions had potentially violated federal data protection regulations. If client data had been compromised or if the system failures resulted in breaches of contractual obligations, the company faced regulatory investigations, massive fines, and lawsuits from affected clients. Brandon panicked. His face went white and his hands started shaking. He turned on me and said this was my fault for not securing the server room properly. He demanded to know why someone with just a set of keys could access critical systems. I stayed calm and explained that the server room had biometric locks, requiring both keys and fingerprint authentication. The keys alone should not have granted access. Craig pulled up the security system logs on his computer. He studied them for a moment, then looked up with confusion. He said that at 11:45 the previous night, someone had used an administrative override code to disable the biometric authentication system for the server room. The override remained active for 30 minutes, which was just long enough for Brandon to enter and cause the damage. Martin asked Brandon where he had gotten the override code. Brandon hesitated, then admitted that his father had given him a list of emergency access codes when he took over as CEO. The list included codes for various systems throughout the building. Richard had told him they were for emergencies and that he could use them if needed. Martin looked stricken. He asked Richard if this was true. Richard confirmed that he had given Brandon the codes, but said he had also scheduled a comprehensive briefing with Martin and the department heads to explain what each code was for and when they should be used. Brandon was supposed to attend that briefing yesterday afternoon. Richard asked Brandon if he had gone to the briefing. Brandon admitted he had skipped it because he thought it was unnecessary. He said he figured the codes were self-explanatory. The silence that followed was devastating. Andrew Chen, the risk consultant, made several phone calls while we waited. When he returned, his expression was grim. He reported that 3 of TechVista's major clients had already detected the service disruptions and were invoking penalty clauses in their contracts. Based on preliminary assessment, the company's total financial exposure could exceed $10 million. He added that the company's liability insurance would not cover damages resulting from executive misconduct. Martin took me aside to a small conference room. He closed the door and made a proposition. The company desperately needed me to stay temporarily to help resolve the crisis. In exchange, they would honor my contract fully and pay the 2 years of severance I was entitled to. He said I could work as a consultant for the next 2 weeks, help get systems back online and stabilize client relationships, then leave with a substantial financial cushion. I wanted to say yes. The money would solve my immediate problems and give me time to find the right next opportunity. But I hesitated because I knew accepting meant being pulled into Brandon's disaster. If things got worse, I might end up being blamed. I had already been publicly humiliated and fired. Did I really want to risk being dragged further into this mess? Before I could answer, Brandon's phone rang. He took the call in the main IT area where everyone could hear, his face drained of all color as he listened. When he ended the call, his hand was trembling. He announced that Tech Vista's largest client, representing 30% of annual revenue, was terminating their contract effective immediately due to the service outage. Their legal team was also exploring litigation for damages and breach of contract. Brandon looked directly at me. For the first time since I had met him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He said I had to fix this. Not asked, not requested, demanded. As if he still had the authority to order me around after firing me and creating this catastrophe himself. I stood in the IT department watching Brandon's desperation, and my mind raced through calculations. If I walked away right now, I would have the moral high ground. I could pursue my severance through legal channels and let Brandon face the consequences of his actions alone. But I also knew that if Tech Vista collapsed, hundreds of innocent people would lose their jobs. Jennifer, in accounting, Craig and his entire team, the salespeople and developers and support staff who had done nothing wrong, they would all suffer. Brandon pulled me into a small conference room with Martin following close behind. He closed the door and offered me my job back. He said I could return as Director of Operations with a 20% salary increase and a seat on the executive leadership team. His tone tried to sound magnanimous, but I heard the desperation underneath. I asked him directly what would happen when the crisis was over, and he decided he did not need me anymore. I asked if he would fire me again the moment it was convenient. Brandon promised he would not. He said he had learned his lesson and would value my contributions going forward. His words sounded hollow. I looked at Martin. He said nothing, but his expression told me everything. He did not trust Brandon's promises any more than I did. Martin had worked with the Whitmore family for 15 years, and he knew something I was only beginning to understand. Brandon did not learn lessons. He manipulated situations to serve himself, and discarded people when they were no longer useful. An emergency board meeting was called for 2 o'clock that afternoon. I was asked to attend. I sat in the same conference room where Brandon had fired me just 24 hours earlier. The 5 board members looked exhausted and worried. The board chair, Dorothy Sutherland, was a retired executive in her late 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. She had served on the board for 12 years and had a reputation for being fair but demanding. Dorothy asked me to explain exactly what had happened and what would be required to fix it. I provided a clear, factual account without emotional editorializing. I described the technical damage to the systems and the timeline for recovery. I estimated it would take at least 2 weeks of intensive work to restore full functionality and rebuild client trust. I explained that several major clients would need personal outreach and reassurance. The financial penalties would need to be negotiated. The board members exchanged worried glances. One of them, a man named Thomas Reed, who had been Richard's college roommate, asked if I was willing to lead the recovery effort. I paused and chose my words carefully. I said I would consider it under specific conditions. Dorothy asked what conditions. I stated them clearly. First, I wanted my Director of Operations position formally restored with a written apology from Brandon delivered to all staff. Second, I wanted a new 3-year employment contract with termination protections even stronger than my previous contract. Third, I wanted Brandon to have no authority over IT, operations, or facilities during the recovery period. Fourth, I wanted a $50,000 bonus paid when systems were fully restored and client relationships were stabilized. The board members conferred privately for 15 minutes. Dorothy returned and said they would accept all my conditions except they could not legally restrict Brandon's authority as CEO. The board could advise but not override his executive decisions. I stood up to leave. Dorothy stopped me and asked what it would take to make me stay. I said I needed a written directive from the board temporarily reassigning operational authority to me for the recovery period. Brandon would remain CEO, but would not be permitted to make decisions about IT infrastructure, operations, or client relationships without my approval. The directive would expire in 2 weeks, at which point normal authority structures would resume. Brandon exploded. He said the board could not undermine him like this in front of employees. He said it would destroy his credibility and make him look weak. Dorothy turned to him with an expression of cold fury. She told him that his father had built this company over 30 years through hard work and integrity. Brandon was destroying it in 2 days through arrogance and incompetence. She said credibility was earned through competence, not titles. Dorothy connected a video call to Richard. His face appeared on the large monitor at the front of the room. He looked smaller somehow, frailer than just a week ago. Dorothy explained the situation and the board's proposed solution. Richard listened without interrupting. When Dorothy finished, Richard spoke directly to Brandon. He said he had given Brandon an opportunity to lead, and Brandon had failed catastrophically. He said the board's decision to temporarily reassign authority was not just reasonable, but necessary to save the company. Brandon started to argue. Richard's voice, though weak, became firm. He told Brandon this was his last chance to prove he could learn and grow. If Brandon could not accept these terms, Richard would return as CEO despite his deteriorating health. Brandon sat down heavily in his chair. His face was red and his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. He agreed through gritted teeth. The board drafted the directive on the spot. All 5 members signed it. Martin made copies. I received one, Brandon received one, and copies were distributed to all department heads. I had 2 weeks of absolute operational authority. But I had also made a powerful enemy, and I knew Brandon would spend every moment of those 2 weeks looking for ways to destroy me the instant my protection expired. I spent the rest of that day with Craig's IT team developing a detailed recovery plan. We identified the critical systems that needed to be restored first. We mapped out the sequence of repairs and the resources required. I coordinated with the legal team to draft communications for affected clients. I personally called the CEO of the major client who had threatened to terminate their contract. I apologized for the disruption, explained what had happened without blaming anyone specifically, and promised we would have preliminary systems online within 48 hours. The CEO agreed to give us 1 week to demonstrate progress before making a final decision about the contract. By 8 o'clock that evening, I was alone in my restored office. Someone had brought my belongings back from where Brandon had them stored. My coffee mug sat on the desk. The photo of my mother was back on the shelf. The succulent plant looked slightly wilted but alive. I looked at the employment contract and board directive sitting in front of me. I had won this round, but the victory felt fragile. Brandon would undermine me at every opportunity. He would document every small mistake and build a case against me. When the 2 weeks ended, he would find a way to fire me again, this time with enough documentation to avoid paying severance. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was an address I did not recognize, a random string of letters and numbers at a free email service. The subject line read, "You should know what Brandon is planning." I opened it with my heart pounding. The email contained a forwarded message chain between Brandon and an outside consultant. The messages discussed strategies for documenting my mistakes during the recovery period. They talked about planting doubts about my decision-making and building a case for termination with cause. The plan was to let me fix the crisis, then fire me immediately afterward before I could claim the completion bonus. The anonymous sender had written below the forwarded messages, "He has been planning this since the board meeting ended. Be careful. Trust no one." I sat staring at my computer screen as the office lights automatically dimmed around me. I had walked back into a trap, and now I had 2 weeks to either escape it or be destroyed by it. I took screenshots of the anonymous email and forwarded them to my personal account. I could not confront Brandon directly without revealing I had a source inside the company feeding me information. Instead, I decided to be meticulous about documenting everything I did. I started a detailed log with timestamps for every decision, every meeting, and every communication. I copied Martin on all important emails, so there would be a legal record. The first week was brutal. I worked 16-hour days. Craig's team restored the core systems piece by piece. We brought the customer database back online first, then the payment processing system. By day 3, we had partial functionality for the flagship software service. By day 5, 70% of systems were operational. Client communications improved as we demonstrated real progress. Craig and his team were exhausted but cautiously hopeful. I held daily briefings with the board at 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening. Dorothy praised our progress each time. The other board members seemed relieved. Brandon attended these meetings but barely spoke. He sat at the far end of the table watching me with cold, calculating eyes. I could feel his hatred like a physical presence in the room. Around day 4, I started noticing small obstacles. Supplies I had ordered for the IT team were mysteriously canceled. When I investigated, the purchasing department said they received a cancellation request from executive leadership. A crucial meeting I had scheduled with a key client was rescheduled without my knowledge. I discovered this only when the client's assistant called to confirm the new time. Reports I had prepared and saved to the shared drive would disappear, forcing me to recreate them or retrieve them from backup. Each incident was small enough to seem like administrative error. But the pattern was clear. Someone was sabotaging my work in subtle ways, trying to slow me down or make me look disorganized. On day 6, I learned that Brandon had brought in Derek Shaw full-time. Derek was the consultant who had been with Brandon during the original confrontation in the IT department. Derek shadowed my work constantly, asking pointed questions and taking extensive notes. When I asked Craig about Derek, Craig said Derek had been interviewing team members privately, asking about my management style, my decision-making processes, and whether anyone had concerns about my leadership. I realized Brandon was building a case against me, exactly as the anonymous email had warned. He was documenting everything, looking for mistakes or inconsistencies he could use to justify termination with cause. On day 8, disaster struck. One of the systems we had restored began malfunctioning. Client data was mixing incorrectly between accounts. A small business owner logged in and saw financial information belonging to a completely different company. Within an hour, 3 more clients reported similar issues. Craig's team investigated urgently. Craig found the problem. Someone had changed a critical configuration setting in the database management system. The change was subtle, but devastating. When Craig checked the system logs, his face went pale. The modification had been made at 2 in the morning on day 7, using my login credentials. I told Craig that was impossible. I was home sleeping at 2 in the morning. I had not been in the office. Craig showed me the logs. They clearly displayed my username and password. The security system also showed someone entering the server room at 1:58 in the morning. The timestamp matched perfectly. Derek called an emergency meeting with the board that afternoon. Brandon presented the evidence with barely concealed satisfaction. He showed the login records, the security footage, and a written statement from a night janitor who claimed he saw me in the building late that night. The janitor described someone wearing dark pants and a blue blouse, which matched what I had worn to the office the previous day. Derek spoke in a measured, professional tone. He suggested that the pressure of the recovery effort might have caused me to make a catastrophic error, or possibly that I had sabotaged the system deliberately to extend the crisis and justify my continued employment. He recommended suspending me, immediately pending a full investigation. I felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath me. I pulled out my phone and showed my location history, which clearly indicated I was at my apartment all night. I explained that someone must have stolen or duplicated my login credentials. Martin supported me, pointing out that I would have no rational motive to sabotage my own recovery effort. But Thomas Reed, the board member who was Richard's old friend, said the evidence was deeply concerning and suggested a temporary suspension might be appropriate. Dorothy stopped the discussion. She said accusations of this magnitude required proper investigation before any action was taken. She announced she was hiring an independent cybersecurity firm to conduct a forensic analysis of the breach. She said I would continue working during the investigation, but that all my actions would be closely monitored. The meeting adjourned with nothing resolved, but I knew my credibility was damaged. Brandon smiled slightly as he left the room. I understood his strategy now. Even if he could not fire me immediately, he had planted doubt. Board members would question every decision I made. Employees would wonder if I was trustworthy. When the investigation concluded, Brandon would find a way to spin the results against me regardless of what the truth was. That night, I received another anonymous email. This one contained security footage from a different camera angle than what Derek had shown the board. The footage showed the person who entered the server room at 1:58 in the morning. The figure's body type and movement patterns were clearly different from mine. The person walked with a longer stride and broader shoulders. The anonymous sender wrote, "Look at the keycard swipe timestamp. cross-reference it with the building access logs. Someone cloned her credentials. I met Craig at a coffee shop 3 miles from the office the next morning before work. I showed him the footage on my phone. Craig watched it carefully, then watched it again. He agreed the person in the video was definitely not me. Craig mentioned something else. 2 days ago, my access badge was recorded at 3 different locations within a 5-minute period. I was supposedly on the 3rd floor, in the basement, and in the parking garage simultaneously. That was physically impossible. Someone had cloned my credentials, both digital and physical, but proving who did it required access to security systems that Brandon now controlled. The cybersecurity firm would not begin their investigation for another 2 days. Until then, I was working under a cloud of suspicion. I continued through days 9 and 10 feeling like I was walking through a minefield. Derek followed me constantly. Brandon held private meetings with board members. I learned from Jennifer that Brandon was telling people I was cracking under pressure and becoming unstable. On day 11, Martin took me to lunch at a restaurant 30 minutes away from the office. He chose a booth in the back where we could not be overheard. Martin looked tired and deeply troubled. He told me quietly that Brandon was more dangerous than I realized. Martin had worked with the Whitmore family for 20 years. He had watched Brandon manipulate and destroy people who stood in his way, both in business and in his personal life. Martin said Brandon was patient and calculating. He would smile and act friendly while plotting someone's downfall. He had ruined a former business partner through a carefully orchestrated campaign of rumors and manufactured evidence. The partner lost everything and could not prove Brandon's involvement. Martin warned me that even if I survived this crisis, Brandon would never stop hunting me. He would wait months or even years for the perfect opportunity to strike. I went back to my office after lunch and closed the door. For the first time since this nightmare began, I completely broke down. I sat at my desk with my head in my hands and cried. I had worked myself to exhaustion trying to save a company whose CEO was actively trying to destroy me. I questioned why I was fighting so hard. The money was not worth this. No job was worth this level of toxicity and stress. I could take my severance and leave, find another company that would value me, start fresh somewhere without this poison. But then I looked up and saw a photo on my shelf. It was from a company event 3 years ago. I stood with Richard, Craig, Jennifer, and a dozen other employees. We were all smiling, celebrating a successful product launch that we had worked on together for 9 months. I remembered that day. The pride, the camaraderie, the sense of building something meaningful with people I respected. I realized I was not fighting for Brandon. I was not even fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the people in that photo, and hundreds like them who had built careers at Tech Vista. They deserved better than watching their company collapse because of one man's ego and cruelty. My phone rang. It was Dorothy. Her voice was urgent. The cybersecurity firm had found something important. They needed me at the office immediately for an emergency board meeting. Dorothy would not say more over the phone. I grabbed my keys and drove back to the office with my heart pounding, unsure whether I was about to be vindicated or destroyed. I arrived at Tech Vista at 7:15 in the evening. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a handful of cars near the main entrance. The board was assembled in the large conference room. The lead investigator from the cybersecurity firm, a woman in her 40s named Susan Park, stood at the front with her laptop connected to the large monitor. Brandon and Derek sat on one side of the table looking confident. Dorothy gestured for me to sit near Martin. Dorothy called the meeting to order and asked Susan to present her findings. Susan introduced herself and her credentials. She had 20 years of experience in digital forensics and had worked on cases involving corporate espionage, data breaches, and cybercrime. Her firm had been hired to determine how my credentials were compromised and who was responsible for the database sabotage. Susan explained methodically. Her team had traced the unauthorized access to my login credentials. They discovered that my username and password had been compromised when someone installed keylogging software on a shared computer in the operations department. The software captured keystrokes whenever anyone used that computer. My password was recorded when I gave a presentation to the operations team and needed to log into my account to access files. The keylogger had been installed on a Tuesday afternoon 4 days before Brandon became CEO. Susan displayed the installation timestamp on the monitor. Brandon immediately said that proved he had nothing to do with it since he was not even CEO yet. Susan said nothing and continued her presentation. The keylogger sent captured data to an external email address. Susan's team traced that email address to a burner account created specifically to receive the stolen credentials. They could not identify the person behind the burner account directly, but they were able to trace the IP address used to create it. That IP address belonged to the offices of Shaw Consulting Group, Derek's firm. The room exploded. Derek jumped to his feet, his face flushed red. He insisted there must be an error. He said IP addresses could be spoofed or the data could be wrong. Susan remained calm and professional. She said her firm was one of the most respected cybersecurity companies in the country, and she had personally verified every detail of the investigation. She added that the same IP address from Shaw Consulting Group had been used to remotely access TechVista's systems on the night of the database sabotage. Dorothy asked Derek directly if he had installed the keylogger. Derek denied it vehemently. He said he had never been in the operations department. He had never even been in the TechVista building before Brandon hired him. Susan pulled up additional security footage. The video showed Derek entering the operations department on the exact date and time the keylogger was installed. The footage showed him walking to the shared computer, sitting down, typing for approximately 3 minutes, then leaving. Derek's face went white. He looked at Brandon and said he needed to speak with his attorney immediately. Dorothy told him he could call his attorney after the meeting concluded. She wanted to hear the rest of Susan's findings. Martin stood up. He asked the question everyone was thinking. Did Brandon know about this? Brandon denied any knowledge. He said Derek must have acted alone and without authorization. Martin pointed out that Derek was Brandon's personal hire and had been working under Brandon's direct supervision. Martin asked what instructions Brandon had given Derek. Brandon hesitated. He said he had told Derek to document my performance and look for any issues that might justify termination. He insisted he never told Derek to break the law or sabotage systems. Martin asked if Brandon had those instructions in writing. Brandon said they had discussed it verbally. Susan revealed another finding. Her team had examined email communications between Derek and Brandon. They found messages discussing ways to create leverage against me. One email from Brandon to Derek said, "We need something concrete that proves she is unfit for the position." Another message said, "Find mistakes or create situations where mistakes become inevitable." The emails did not explicitly mention sabotage, but they strongly suggested Brandon wanted Derek to manufacture grounds for termination. The board members looked horrified. 2 of them immediately called for Brandon's resignation. Dorothy raised her hand for silence. She said they needed to contact Richard before making decisions about Brandon's future. However, Derek's employment was finished. She instructed Martin to inform Derek that his consulting contract was terminated immediately and that he needed to leave the premises. Derek protested. Dorothy told security to escort him out if necessary. 2 security guards appeared at the door. Derek gathered his belongings and left, escorted by the guards. The door closed behind him with a heavy sound. Dorothy turned to me. She formally apologized on behalf of the entire board for the ordeal I had endured. She confirmed that my name was completely cleared and praised my professionalism throughout the crisis. She said the board recognized that I had worked under enormous pressure while being actively undermined, and they were grateful for my dedication. I felt relief wash over me, but I also felt numb. Being proven innocent did not erase the damage. The suspicion, the doubt, the constant surveillance had taken a toll I could not easily quantify. My trust in the company and in leadership was shattered. Dorothy made a video call to Richard. His face appeared on the monitor, looking even more frail than before. Dorothy explained everything that had happened, including Derek's actions and Brandon's apparent involvement. Richard listened in complete silence. When Dorothy finished, the silence stretched for nearly a minute. Richard stared at the camera with an expression of profound sadness and disappointment. Then Richard spoke directly to Brandon. He said he was deeply disappointed. He said he had given Brandon every advantage in life, every opportunity to succeed, and Brandon had chosen deception and cruelty instead of integrity. He said Brandon was not fit to be CEO of TechVista Solutions or any company. Brandon's composure finally cracked. He begged his father for another chance. He blamed Derek for everything. He said Derek had acted without authorization and twisted Brandon's instructions. He promised he would do better, if given more time. Richard cut him off mid-sentence. Richard said that even if Brandon had not directly ordered the sabotage, Brandon had created an environment that encouraged it. He said Brandon's first instinct when facing problems was to attack and destroy rather than build and support. Richard announced that he was resuming the role of CEO effective immediately, despite his health issues, until a proper successor could be found. Brandon would remain on the board but would have no operational authority whatsoever. Brandon would participate in strategic discussions but could not make decisions about personnel, operations, or finances. Brandon lost control completely. He stood up and shouted at his father through the video screen. He called Richard weak and said the company had been coasting for years on past success. He claimed I had manipulated everyone and turned them against him. He said he should have fired more people on his first day to establish real authority and respect. His voice rose with each sentence until he was nearly screaming. The board members sat in stunned silence. Brandon's outburst revealed his true character completely. He had no remorse, no understanding of what he had done wrong. He blamed everyone except himself. Dorothy had heard enough. She called for an immediate vote to remove Brandon from the board entirely. She said his behavior was unacceptable and his presence was destructive to the company. 4 board members voted yes without hesitation. Thomas Reed abstained but did not vote no. The motion passed. Brandon was removed from the board of directors of Tech Vista Solutions. Security was called again. Brandon stood there, chest heaving, face red and twisted with rage. As the guards approached, he looked directly at me with pure hatred in his eyes. He said quietly, so only those closest could hear, "This is not over." Then he was escorted from the building. The meeting ended. Board members came up to me individually and offered their congratulations and thanks. Craig appeared from somewhere and hugged me, saying I had saved all their jobs. Jennifer arrived with a bottle of champagne someone had found in the break room. People were celebrating, but I felt detached from it all. I could not forget Brandon's final words. "This is not over." It sounded like a threat. I wondered what he might do now that he had lost everything. Dorothy asked me to join a private video call with Richard. On the screen, Richard looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear and focused. He thanked me for everything I had done. He apologized for the nightmare I had endured. He said he should have recognized who his son truly was years ago, but parental love had blinded him to Brandon's faults. Then Richard asked me a question that took my breath away. He asked if I would consider becoming the next CEO of Tech Vista Solutions. I was speechless. CEO had never been part of my career aspirations. I had always seen myself as an operations leader, someone who made things run smoothly behind the scenes. Richard explained that I had proven myself capable, ethical, and beloved by the team. The company needed someone who embodied its core values. He said he believed I was that person. I asked for time to think about it. Richard smiled gently and said to take all the time I needed. He hoped I would say yes, but he would understand if I chose a different path. We ended the call, and I sat alone in the conference room processing what had just happened. I drove home that night feeling surreal. I had gone from fired to vindicated to offered the CEO position in less than 2 weeks. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something on my windshield. It was a handwritten note tucked under the wiper blade. I got out and pulled it free. The note was written in block letters on plain white paper. It read, "Congratulations on your victory. But be careful. Brandon knows where you live. Watch your back." The note was unsigned. I looked around my quiet neighborhood. Houses with lit windows. Empty streets. Normal suburban silence. Suddenly it all felt threatening. I hurried inside and locked every door and window, my heart pounding with fear that had nothing to do with work or careers and everything to do with personal safety. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jump. I kept the note and called the police first thing in the morning. 2 officers came to my house and took a report. They were polite but not particularly concerned. One officer explained that without an explicit threat of violence or evidence of stalking, there was little they could do. They would increase patrols in my neighborhood and advised me to install a security system. They took the note as evidence but said anonymous warnings were not illegal. I called Martin and Dorothy and told them about the note. They took it much more seriously. Dorothy arranged for a security consultation at my house that same day. The company paid for a full alarm system with cameras, motion sensors, and direct connection to a monitoring service. The installation took 6 hours. By evening, I felt marginally safer, though the fear lingered. Over the next few days, I thought constantly about Richard's offer. I talked with my mother, who, despite her illness, was sharp and supportive. She told me she was proud of me no matter what I decided, but she thought I should take the CEO position. She said opportunities like this came once in a lifetime, and I had earned it through integrity and hard work. I talked with Craig and Jennifer over coffee. They both encouraged me enthusiastically. Craig said the company would thrive under my leadership. Jennifer said everyone would be relieved to have someone they trusted in charge. Their confidence meant more to me than they knew. I realized something important during those conversations. If I walked away now, Brandon would win in a different way. He would have driven me away from a company I loved and a team I cared about. Letting fear control my decisions would be its own kind of defeat. I called Dorothy and accepted the position. 2 weeks after Brandon's removal, Richard held a company-wide meeting via video conference from his home. He was too weak to come to the office, but he wanted to make this announcement personally. Every employee gathered in the main conference room and satellite offices. Hundreds of faces on screens watched as Richard introduced me as the new CEO of TechVista Solutions, effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. People stood and cheered. I saw tears on faces around me. Craig was clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Jennifer was crying and laughing at the same time. The response was overwhelming and deeply moving. Richard spoke about my 7 years of dedication, my integrity during crisis, and my natural leadership abilities. He said he should have made this decision years earlier. He formally retired and signed his shares into a trust designed to support the company's long-term stability rather than short-term profit. He told me he believed in me completely, and knew TechVista would thrive under my guidance. I stood at the front of the room with tears in my eyes and thanked Richard. I thanked the team for their support and trust. I promised to lead with the same values Richard had built the company on: integrity, excellence, and respect for every person. The applause continued for what felt like minutes. My first month as CEO was intense but rewarding. I focused on rebuilding trust with clients who had been affected by the system failures. I personally visited 3 major clients and renegotiated terms that were fair to everyone. I stabilized operations and implemented new security protocols to prevent future incidents. I promoted Craig to Vice President of Technology with a significant raise. I gave Jennifer new responsibilities in finance and a promotion to controller. I hired 2 additional board members with strong operational backgrounds and diverse perspectives. The company began to recover and grow. Revenue increased 18% in my first quarter. Employee satisfaction scores, measured by an independent survey, were the highest in company history. 3 major new clients signed contracts specifically because they liked the direction the company was moving. People started calling TechVista a great place to work again. I learned through Martin that Brandon had attempted to sue the company for wrongful termination from the board. His lawsuit was dismissed quickly because he had been removed through a legitimate vote following clear evidence of misconduct. Brandon then tried to start a competing company using connections from his father's network. No investor would fund him once they heard what had happened at TechVista. Brandon's reputation in the industry was permanently damaged. 3 months into my tenure, I received one final anonymous email. The sender revealed herself as Patricia Morgan, Richard's executive assistant for 20 years. Patricia explained that she had witnessed Brandon's cruelty from the very beginning and could not stand by while he destroyed Richard's legacy. She had installed hidden monitoring software to document Brandon's actions after he first threatened to fire longtime employees. She had been my anonymous source throughout the crisis. Patricia said she was retiring and moving to Arizona to be near her grandchildren. She wanted me to know the truth before she left. I met Patricia for coffee at a small cafe near her house. She was in her mid-60s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. She told me she had watched me grow from a nervous junior project manager into a confident leader, and she was proud to have helped protect me when it mattered most. I thanked her with genuine gratitude. Patricia said I had earned everything through my own strength and character. She just made sure the truth came to light. 6 months after becoming CEO, Tech Vista was genuinely thriving. Revenue was up 23% compared to the previous year. We had hired 30 new employees. The culture had transformed into something positive, supportive, and innovative. Industry publications wrote articles about our turnaround. I was invited to speak at conferences about crisis management and ethical leadership. One evening, I was leaving the office around 7:30 when I noticed someone standing near my car in the parking lot. My heart jumped with fear. Then I recognized the figure. It was Brandon. I considered calling security, but something made me walk toward him instead. I stayed near the building entrance where cameras could see us clearly. Brandon looked different. He had lost weight. His clothes were less expensive than before. He looked tired and defeated. Brandon asked if we could talk. I agreed, but stayed several feet away. Brandon told me he had spent the past 6 months in therapy trying to understand why he had acted the way he did. He said his therapist had helped him recognize patterns of entitlement, insecurity, and narcissism that had controlled his behavior his entire life. He admitted he had been jealous of me from the start because employees respected me naturally while he had to demand respect and never received it. Brandon said his ego and sense of entitlement had destroyed his opportunity to lead. He had viewed leadership as power over people rather than service to them. He apologized for everything: the public humiliation, the sabotage attempts, the threats. He said he did not expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know he recognized how wrong and harmful his actions had been. I listened carefully. When he finished, I told him that what he did was not just wrong but deeply harmful to many innocent people. His actions had caused financial damage, emotional trauma, and destroyed trust. However, I appreciated that he was taking responsibility and seeking help. I said I could not forgive him easily, because trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. But I hoped he would continue therapy and find a path forward that did not involve hurting others. I wished him well, but made clear we would not be friends or colleagues again. Brandon nodded. He thanked me for listening and said he understood. He walked away across the parking lot to an older sedan that was clearly not the luxury car he used to drive. I watched him leave and felt something unexpected: pity. Brandon had been born with every advantage and squandered all of it through arrogance and cruelty. I had fought for everything I had and won through resilience and integrity. I went back to my office on the top floor. It was the same office Richard had used for 30 years. I sat at the desk and looked out at the city lights. I thought about the journey from standing in that conference room being publicly fired to sitting here as CEO. I thought about all the moments I wanted to give up, all the times the obstacles seemed impossible to overcome. I realized my strength had never come from being fearless. Fear had been my constant companion throughout this ordeal. My strength came from choosing to act with integrity even when I was terrified, from standing back up every time I was knocked down, from refusing to let cruelty and injustice have the final word. I opened my laptop and composed an email to all employees. I shared part of my story, not for sympathy, but to illustrate an important lesson. I wrote that everyone faces moments when they are knocked down unfairly, moments when the world seems cruel and victory seems impossible. What defines us is not whether we fall, but whether we choose to stand back up. I encouraged every employee to support each other, to lead with integrity, and to remember that true power comes from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. I sent the email and felt a sense of peace. I thought about my mother, whose health was slowly improving with better medical care I could now easily afford. I thought about the employees whose livelihoods I had helped protect. I thought about Richard, who had entrusted me with his life's work. I felt profound gratitude. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Craig. The IT team wanted to take me out for dinner to celebrate the company's successful quarter and thank me for believing in them during the crisis. I smiled and texted back that I would love to join them. I locked my office and headed down to the lobby. Craig, Jennifer, and half a dozen other colleagues were waiting by the entrance. They greeted me with smiles and warmth. We walked out together into the cool evening air, heading toward a restaurant a few blocks away. As we walked, I thought about that moment 2 weeks ago when I slid those keys across the conference table to Brandon. I had no idea those keys would expose the truth, and ultimately lead me to where I stood now. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives contain the seeds of our greatest transformations. Sometimes being knocked down is the first step toward rising higher than we ever imagined possible. I was surrounded by people who respected and trusted me. I had earned my position through character and perseverance. The nightmare was over. The victory was complete. And the future stretched ahead, filled with possibility and purpose. I had handed over the keys, and in doing so, unlocked a door to a future I never knew I deserved. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment when someone tried to destroy your career or reputation? How did you respond? Did you fight back or walk away? What would you do if you were in my position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing your stories and perspectives. If this story resonated with you, or gave you hope during your own difficult times, please give it a like. It helps more people find these stories and reminds all of us that integrity and resilience matter. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story about ordinary people overcoming extraordinary challenges. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, someone who is facing their own workplace nightmare or personal crisis, please share this story with them. Sometimes knowing we are not alone makes all the difference. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. I hope you carry forward the reminder that no matter how dark things seem, you have the strength to stand back up and create the future you deserve. Be kind to yourself and to others. Stand up for what is right even when it is hard, and never let anyone convince you that cruelty is stronger than integrity. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep believing in your own resilience.